Testing, testing. everyone could take their seats, please. We're about to begin, if there are any seats. Good evening, Your Eminence, Your Excellency, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone joining us via live stream across the world. My name is Diane Montagna, and it's my great honor and pleasure to be the moderator of this evening's presentation of Credo, His Excellency Athanasius Schneider's new Compendium of the Catholic Faith, published by Sophia Institute Press. Credo, for those who have not seen it, Credo is the most up-to-date catechism in print and is the first such work by a Catholic bishop in over 50 years, helping the reader to know what to believe, how to live, and how to pray as Christ taught. Using a simple and direct question and answer format, the compendium offers, in the pastoral style of the apostles, a clear and concise summary of Catholicism as a whole. But what makes this book especially significant is how Bishop Schneider applies these timeless truths to current issues with courage, charity, and a zeal for the salvation of souls. Gender ideology, transgenderism, science and evolution, drug use, social media use, pornography and sex education are just some of the issues he covers, as well as the fundamentals of the faith, providing believers and non-believers alike with powerful and decisive answers to many of the world's most deeply pressing challenges, but always with Christ, sacred scripture, and the apostolic tradition as his point of departure. Many of these scourges and challenges were not, of course, present when the Catechism of the Catholic Church was promulgated in 1992, and so it makes this new Compendium of the Catholic Faith all the more timely and needed. But without further ado, I will now introduce our first speaker of our distinguished panel, His Eminence Robert Cardinal Sarah. Born in Guinea in 1945, His Eminence entered the seminary at age 12 and was ordained a priest in 1969. As bishop in the 1980s, and it should be said that he was appointed by Pope John Paul II, but first, before, he had been appointed a bishop at the age of 33 by Pope Paul VI, but it was not allowed to go forward by the government. In the 1980s, he faced many challenges, including being put on a hit list drawn up by Guinean dictator Ahmed Sékou. In 1979, he had been consecrated bishop by John Paul II. Benedict XVI elevated then Archbishop Sarah to cardinal in 2010, and he headed 2 curial posts, president of the Pontifical Council Cor Unum and prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. His Eminence, as you know, is renowned for his prophetic and profound writings on the faith, including God or Nothing, his volume with Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI on the gift of priestly celibacy from the depths of our hearts, and his recent work published by Sophia Institute Press, Catechism of the Spiritual Life. He is revered as one of the Church's foremost teachers of the faith, with an ability to effectively apply the Church's teaching to our troubled world. Please join me in welcoming His Eminence Robert Cardinal Sarah.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, prima di tutto vorrei ringraziare Sua Eccellenza Monsignor Athanasius Schneider per avermi invitato a prendere parte a questa presentazione del suo ultimo libro. Ma come non ringraziare voi tutti qui presenti per l'amicizia, per l'onore della vostra presenza, avete accettato di consacrare il vostro tempo così prezioso per venire ad ascoltare illustri personalità che ci aiutano a apprezzare questo compendio e le ricchezze del mistero della nostra fede cattolica. In questo tempo di grave crisi della Chiesa, di confusione e soprattutto nel sentire molto spesso troppe voci discordanti che escono dalla bocca di tanti prelati di alto livello di responsabilità su questioni dottrinali e morali e sull'accoglienza di ideologie che negano Dio e i suoi insegnamenti sulla natura e la missione dell'uomo. La pubblicazione del libro Credo, un Compendium della fede cattolica è una iniziativa di grande importanza ed è arrivata al momento opportuno. Infatti, regna oggi una vera cacofonia negli insegnamenti dei pastori, vescovi e sacerdoti. Essi sembrano contraddirsi. Ciascuno impone la propria opinione personale come se fosse una certezza. Ne risulta una situazione di confusione, di ambiguità e di apostasia. Un grande disorientamento, un profondo smarrimento e devastanti incertezze sono stati inoculati nell'animo di molti fedeli cristiani. Il filosofo tedesco Robert Cardinal descriveva con chiarezza tale smarrimento con una citazione attinta dalla prima lettera di San Paolo Apostolo ai Corinzi. E se la tromba emette un suono confuso, chi si prepara al combattimento? E proprio per questo io scrivevo nel mio endorsement di questo libro, cito: molti hanno detto tante cose sulla fede cattolica. Alcune affermazioni sono confuse, altre completamente erronee. Per questa ragione dobbiamo ringraziare Sua Eccellenza Monsignor Schneider per questa esposizione fedele, concisa, profonda e veramente aggiornata dell'insegnamento della Chiesa. Pienamente consapevole dell'incarico ricevuto al momento della sua consacrazione episcopale di trasmettere integralmente e fedelmente ciò che lui stesso ha ricevuto dalla tradizione vivente della Chiesa. In questo compendium, Sua Eccellenza Monsignor Schneider invita tutti gli uomini e donne di buona volontà ad approfondire, anche quando necessario, a correggere la loro conoscenza della dottrina cattolica. Le sue domande e risposte chiare e concise facilitano tale approfondimento e allo stesso momento la sua assidua annotazione delle fonti incoraggia una esplorazione più profonda delle ricchezze della fede cattolica. Mentre sono sicuro che questo libro permetterà a Sua Eccellenza Schneider di raggiungere il suo scopo, quello di venire in aiuto di quelli piccoli che sono affamati del pane della sana dottrina. Questo documento si rivelerà anche come uno strumento importante nel cuore del lavoro missionario di evangelizzazione e di apologetica, nell'annuncio della verità salvifica di Gesù Cristo nel nostro mondo che ne ha così disperatamente bisogno. Questo libro ci ricorda la natura e il contenuto ben strutturato delle verità cristiane. Ci aiuta a credere, ma credere si pone sapere, e sapere implica un impegno della ragione per meglio conoscere, interiorizzare, insegnare e trasmettere. Con questo libro ognuno di noi potrebbe essere capace di rifare il proprio cammino di fede, di ritornare ai fondamenti per riscoprire una fede serena che non si vergogna di se stessa. Questo libro potrà contribuire a scoprire in modo più profondo Gesù Cristo, ad amarlo, a credere in Lui e poter dire con San Paolo: so infatti a chi ho creduto e sono convinto che Egli è capace di conservare il deposito che mi è stato affidato. Noi non crediamo a una dottrina, ma amiamo una persona, Gesù Cristo, a chi crediamo. Noi non crediamo ai dogmi, alle ideologie, alla sapienza di questo mondo, ma con la nostra fede in Gesù Cristo ciascuno di noi potrebbe dire: io credo in Gesù Cristo. Non sono più io che vivo, ma Cristo vive in me. Questa vita che vivo nella carne, io la vivo nella fede del Figlio di Dio che mi ha amato e ha dato stesso per me. Crediamo a colui che ha detto: io sono la luce del mondo. Chi segue me non camminerà nel tenebre, ma avrà la luce della vita. Quando manca la luce, tutto diventa confuso, è impossibile distinguere il bene dal male. Urge perciò recuperare il carattere di luce proprio della fede, perché quando la sua fiamma si spegne, anche tutte le altre luci finiscono per perdere il loro vigore. La luce della fede possiede infatti un carattere singolare, essendo capace di illuminare tutta l'esistenza dell'uomo, perché una luce sia potente non può procedere da noi stessi, deve venire da una fonte più originaria, deve venire in definitiva da Dio. Quando parliamo di crisi della Chiesa, è importante precisare che la Chiesa, in quanto corpo mistico di Cristo, continua ad essere una santa, cattolica e apostolica. La teologia, l'insegnamento dottrinale e morale rimangono invariati, immutabili, indisponibili. La Chiesa, come continuazione e prolungamento di Cristo nel mondo, non è in crisi. Siamo noi, i suoi figli peccatori, ad essere in crisi. Essa gode della promessa della vita eterna. Le porte degli inferi non prevarranno mai contro di essa. Infatti Gesù dice a Pietro: Tu es Petrus, e super hang Petram edificabo ecclesiam meam. Et porte inferi non prevalebunt adversum eam. Noi sappiamo, noi crediamo fermamente che in essa ci sarà sempre abbastanza luce per colui che sinceramente vuole andare in ricerca di Dio. La Chiesa non è in crisi, ma i suoi pastori sono profondamente in crisi. L'appello di San Pietro, di San Paolo a Timoteo, suo figlio nella fede, riguarda tutti noi, al cospetto di Dio che dà vita a tutte le cose e di Gesù Cristo che ha dato la sua bella testimonianza davanti a Ponzio Pilato. Custodisci ciò che ti è stato affidato. Evita le chiacchiere vuote e perverse e le obiezioni della falsa scienza. Taluni, per averla seguita, hanno deviato dalla fede. Il deposito della fede continua ad essere un dono divino supernaturale, ma oggi la crisi della Chiesa è entrata in una nuova fase, la crisi del Magistero. Certo, l'autentico Magistero, in quanto funzione supernaturale del corpo mistico di Cristo, esercitata e guidata invisibilmente dallo Spirito Santo, non può essere in crisi. La voce e l'azione dello Spirito Santo sono costanti e la verità verso cui si conduce è salda e immutabile. L'Evangelista Giovanni dice: quando però verrà lo Spirito di verità, egli vi guiderà alla verità tutta intera, perché non parla da sé, ma dirà tutto ciò che avrà udito e vi annunzierà le cose future. Egli mi glorificherà perché prenderà del mio e ve lo annunzierà. Tutto quello che il Padre possiede è mio. Per questo ho detto che prenderà del mio e ve lo annunzierà. Il dogma, la dottrina, la rivelazione divina non cambiano per niente. La Chiesa si tiene davanti al Signore per adorarlo, glorificarlo, e il modo di pregare e di credere è immutabile. Les credendi, lex orandi, hanno camminato fianco a fianco e si sono alimentati a vicenda nel corso della storia della Chiesa. Sì, crediamo che il nostro dogma sia come un seme che cresce ogni giorno Perché non dovremmo vedere il modo in cui preghiamo e esprimiamo il nostro dogma in modo simile? I teologi iniziano lo studio della loro materia approfondendo la conoscenza del campo così come viene loro presentato nell'Antico Testamento, nei scritti del Nuovo Testamento, nei padri della Chiesa e infine nel Magistero della Chiesa. Solo dopo aver percorso un lungo cammino potranno pretendere di conoscere la tradizione e di elaborare una teoria che sia in continuità con la teologia precedente, da un lato, e dall'altro offra una prospettiva attuale e per certi versi originale sulla questione, senza però cambiare la dottrina. Ecco ciò che vuole ricordarci Sua Eccellenza Monsignor Athanasius Schneider nel suo bellissimo libro Credo, un compendium della fede cattolica. Per questo lo ringraziamo immensamente e vi ringrazio per la vostra pazienza e il vostro ascolto indulgente. Grazie.
Your Eminence, thank you very, very much for the profound reflection. Just to note, for those who are English-speaking in the room, just a couple of points that stood out in His Eminence's talk was how this Compendium of the Catholic Faith will serve the little ones who hunger for sound doctrine, how the Church is, in reality, is not in crisis. The Church is the mystical body of Christ, His extension into the world. It's her children who are in crisis, and perhaps above all, her pastors who are in crisis. His Eminence also noted that this crisis has entered into a new phase, the crisis of the magisterium, and that the Holy Spirit does not contradict himself, but as our Lord told the apostles, I believe in the last discourse of the Gospel of John, that he will always take from what is Christ's and give that to, and enlighten our minds as to the truth, who is Christ, the person, the divine person in whom we believe. I just wanted to remind everyone too that after the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. So, but to our next speaker, Jeanne Smits. Jeanne Smits is a Dutch journalist in France who until 2014 served as the director of the French daily Présent. She is now editor-in-chief of the online media Réinformation TV and has a personal blog on pro-life and religious matters. She also works for a number of French Catholic publications, including L'Homme Nouveau and Monde et Vie. She's vice president of the Centre Charlier, which launched the Chartres pilgrimage in the 1980s. And she's also part of the Agrif, a French and Christian Defense League that has existed for over 30 years and that acts as an official anti-racist association in the French justice system. Jeanne Smits has translated several works from English into French, among them Christus Vincit and the Catholic Mass. And she is married with 3 adult children. So please welcome Jeanne Smits.
Thank you so much, Diane, and please forgive my sometimes faulty English because it's not my main language. On the other hand, I have the privilege of knowing the writings of His Excellency, Monsignor Athanasius Schneider, quite well, and it's with great joy that I discovered this catechism, Credo, Compendium of the Catholic Faith, which is soon going to appear also in French. The French translator of this book is with us in the room. I believe that at this time, a few hundred meters from here, in the Aula Paolo VI, a synod is underway, a synod on synodality. And there is so much confusion. I remember one of the first editorials I wrote about Pope Francis was called The Pope of Confusion. And I believe this is unfortunately very true. The teachings we hear are either ambiguous or extremely surprising, to put it mildly. And I think the best answer to that is prayer and sacrifice. But that is not enough. I think we also need to lift the confusion, and the only and best practical answer beyond prayer and sacrifice that we can bring to the present confusion is, of this complete pontificate, is to bring clarity, to recall what the faith actually is, what is its contents, what does it mean, what should the Church be teaching us. And I believe that the book that you wrote, Your Excellency, Credo, which is a very traditional form of catechism, is truly the very response that we now need, every one of us, as I will try to show. And it is all the more important that so many who should be speaking are remaining silent. Of course, we have had reactions to the present errors that are being disseminated among the Catholic flock. But this is a complete response to all the problems we have. It's also a complete response to what we should believe, what our faith that we receive at baptism as a supernatural grace, how it should be nourished. I believe, in fact, to come back to the synod, that this synod has been timed at the worst possible moment in history, or at least in recent history, because there is so much ignorance about the Catholic faith. So we have their pastors, some of whom will tell you nonsense, please forgive me, but that's how I see it as a layperson. And there are laypersons who are allowed to vote, and there has never been so much ignorance about the Catholic faith. So really, this is a terrible time to have a synod. On the other hand, I console myself with the idea that this is not a synod. If it were a synod of bishops, it would be bishops who would be speaking, discussing under the authority of the Pope, and they will be voting. Here we have lay people voting, people who are chosen, co-opted, not because they have a mission to teach in the Ecclesia Docens, the church which gives the magisterium. They are allowed to vote. So this is not a synod. Let's make that very clear. But what is true is that ignorance of the faith has never been so rampant in our modern times. And I believe that it is presently one of the salient realities of Catholicism. So many Catholics, so many baptized people just don't know. They have never been taught the faith. Schools, Catholic schools, and I think this is true in so many countries, at least it is true in France, it is true in the Netherlands, which is my home country. Schools are not doing their job as Catholic schools to transmit the faith. They're just not, they're just telling plenty of stories, having children draw nice drawings. I, as a child, already had that type of catechism, and I remember how empty it was. And may I add that so many pastors, and let's call them bishops, are not doing their job either. They are not giving clear answers to the questions we are posing. Catechism, the catechesis, has been systematically destroyed since the 1960s. In my own country, the Netherlands, we had the infamous Dutch catechism, which contradicted a number of dogmas of the Church. This has led worldwide to a decline of religious practice. And in France, there were the truly awful pierres vivantes, living stones. This was a catechism of the 1970s and 80s, which also turned around the pot, as we say in France, not giving clear answers, and in some places also contradicting the faith, which means that young people who were catechized in the 70s and who are now about my age, well, they don't know. They have not received what they should have received. I had the privilege to work with Jean Madiran. Jean Madiran was a French writer. He founded a monthly which was called Itinéraire in the 1950s, which immediately started defending the traditional Mass, and which was very active during the Council. And then he founded a daily for which I worked. That's where I met him. Jean Madiran fought for the traditional Mass really from the start. And he wrote a violent and almost desperate, but of course we are Catholics, so we are not desperate, appeal to Pope Paul VI. It was entitled, "Give us back the Catechism, Holy Scripture, and the Mass." This little booklet was published in November 1974. At that time, it was already very clear what was happening and what was going to happen. Jean Madiran, was especially concerned by the failure to transmit the faith to children. He edited personally, he re-edited in French the Catechism of the Council of Trent. But he was very sad to see that there was no proper catechism for children. And he had a very critical eye on what was being published at that time and since then. These children who were so badly catechized are now my age, and in so many ways, they are a lost generation. This is a terrible situation. I would say that so many years later, Bishop Schneider has answered Jean Madiran's call with Credo, whose form and content are strictly traditional. It is also particularly exhaustive. It really answers all the questions, as we shall see in a moment. It tells us what we are required to believe, what we are required to hope for, and also how we should live. Faith, morals, our fight to reach the good end among the last ends, and this through the sacraments which are all presented. So it's really a comprehensive presentation of the Catholic faith. This is doctrine, and that's an ugly word nowadays. Some would say it is not pastoral, because it's the faith exposed. It's like this, and it's not any other way. We hear from modern catechists and from modern bishops, the most important thing is to meet with Jesus, and that's what we're going to teach the children, how to meet with Jesus. Well, of course, our faith is a faith in a person and a friend and a God. But we must know and serve and love God. That is what the Catechism teaches us. And we must hope that through his infinite mercy we may obtain eternal bliss with him. And to obtain that, well, there are rules, there are truths to be known. And for that, I'd say we'd need a handbook. We need a roadmap to follow. We need clear definitions. And that is not in any way going to stop us from loving Jesus. It's going to help us to do that in a proper and correct way. And in fact, I believe that there is nothing more pastoral than to offer every Catholic the true, age-old doctrine of the Church. There is nothing more pastoral than that. And that is why I would say that this is a sure and safe book to have, without ambiguity of any kind. It's a book that any faithful can understand. There are all the questions you can pose to yourself. What should I do? What should I think about this? And don't think it's something like the Quran or the Muslims' hadiths, where you get ready-made answers which you're not supposed to think about. There are moral questions in this book, and His Excellency, or maybe His Eminence one day, says, you must think about this with the light given to you by the truth and with reason. We are required as Catholics to reflect and to order our life according to the truth, but we are not being told that every morning at 5:20 we must get up to see whether the moon is announcing the Ramadan or no. This is really a book which calls on people to reflect, but to reflect in truth and not in a servile submission to the truth, but in a true adherence, a free adherence to the supernatural grace of faith, which only God, the Trinity, can give us. And it gives us answers to so many contemporary questions. We have catechisms. I was speaking about the Catechism of the Council of Trent, of which you will find, I think, many traces. This book doesn't just appear out of nowhere. There are so many answers that are just the Catholic faith. But there are answers to questions that we are posing ourselves now, such as, this is a nice one, is anyone allowed to forbid the celebration of the traditional Mass? And Bishop Schneider answers, you're going to be very surprised, no. He speaks about COVID restrictions. Was it right to withhold sacraments from the faithful? The answer is no. Was it right for public powers to impose this on the church? Well, the church should have said, and sometimes did say, no. He speaks about the new Mass and the old Mass. And there is even a very nice section at the end showing the liturgical vestments. And they are the traditional vestments, I've noticed. He speaks of Luther, Martin Luther, who detested the traditional sacrificial rite of the Mass, and in particular, the offertory. And all this is I can't find the word. There are very many quotations of an incredible amount of authors and traditional teachings of the Church. So everything is really well-founded. This book contains the most vigorous condemnation of Freemasonry I've ever seen in a catechism, because in other catechisms you don't see any of those, or not much. Bishop Schneider shows how Freemasonry, in its roots, is actually diabolical. And he doesn't just say that because he wants to think it. He says it with quotations from Freemasons themselves. This book condemns the contemporary paganism of what your Eminence calls ecological mysticism. This is very important in our time when we feel that we should be paying more attention to the planet than to God, and that we should be ready to sacrifice ourselves and our lifestyle for the planet. But that is nonsense. That is idolatry, because we are indeed expected to sacrifice, but the only person who is worthy of our sacrifice is, of course, the triune God. The book speaks about religious liberty, and I think on this chapter it reveals something that is also rampant in the Church. I think every one of us over the years has become in some way contaminated by the modern errors that are going around and around. And we speak about the rights of man. We speak about religious liberty. We talk about human dignity. And we believe that our language is extremely Catholic on those points. Now, the rights of man without God are no more than idolatry themselves. The rights of man are simply rooted in the 10 Commandments. We receive, for instance, the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," which means that in justice, I have a right not to be killed by someone else. But do I have an absolute right to life? Well, no, it is God who gives life. So, in particular, there has been a question about this book's treatment of human dignity. Bishop Schneider shows that there are different levels of human dignity. Human dignity, it is said to us now, is founded on our image and likeness with God. We are certainly, as mankind, as every man and woman, created in the image of God. But are we all to his likeness? Are we to his likeness when we are under the empire of original sin? Are we full of human dignity when we are like Hitler? Surely no. There are degrees of human dignity. And human dignity has been turned upside down, in fact, to make it into something that makes us all brothers and sisters, human fraternity. Our fraternity, according to blood, yes, we are all brothers and sisters and descendants of Adam and Eve. But, as His Eminence clearly shows, true fraternity is the fraternity of the children of God, of the baptized, and of the baptized who are in a state of grace. This is something that jolts even on our ears. But I think we need to reflect on this and to think that our faith brings us the obligation of charity and justice towards every human being, that certainly, but that human beings have varying forms of dignity and they can lose their dignity. So thank you so much for that, Your Excellency. I believe that these concepts have become so adulterated, even in the minds of the most traditional, that this should really be compulsory reading for everyone. This book particularly addresses so many errors that are very present in our time, such as naturalism, believing that man can be saved without supernatural grace. I believe this is extremely important, and it was one of the main themes of His Excellency's book, Christus Vincit. There is a whole section on marriage and the ends of marriage, and here we read something that also grates on modern ears. Marriage is made for procreation, firstly, and then for the other ends of marriage. But is His Excellency, is he just writing what he feels like writing? Of course not. This is the traditional teaching of the Church. There is a little section which I enjoyed on synodalism, or sobornost, as it is called in the Oriental Church, to show the fundamental error of making the magisterium dependent on the collegiality of the bishops. I hope I'm not making a theological mistake here. He speaks about gender ideology. Are you allowed, when you don't feel right in your own gender, are you allowed to change, to have operations, to take drugs? The answer is no. But what I find interesting here is that he is going back to the constant teaching of the Church to bring the answer that they give to these very modern and, in fact, unimaginable problems in earlier times. I think this is truly a dynamic development of tradition, if you will. I would say that this is a book that all families need. When you open the book, of course, you go and read the first pages. And what does it say on the very first page. Dedicated to the mothers of all times, and especially of our day, who even among persecutions transmitted to their children the pure and changeless Catholic faith with mother's milk and love. This is a book for everyone, but this is especially a book for families and a book for mothers, because I think you will agree that we are living in a time when maybe the faithful are not being persecuted, at least in our Western countries, but the faith itself is being persecuted and adulterated. So this book can help people transmit the faith, especially mothers with their love, with their children on their knee, to tell them the beauty and the truth of our religion. And I think, and I would like to thank you, Your Excellency, for what I would call a spiritual work of mercy. This book exists to instruct the ignorant. I think we are all, in some ways, so ignorant. So thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Would that we could fill the Synod Hall with women like Jeanne. Thank you very much for your insightful and inspiring, truly inspiring and insightful talk. Now we'll move from the Netherlands and from France to the United States. Our next speaker is Robert Royal. Robert Royal is the founder and president of the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, a daily online column series that appears in English and 5 foreign languages. He's written, translated, and edited more than 15 books, most recently the widely acclaimed A Deeper Vision, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century, and Columbus and the Crisis of the West, published by our host this evening, Sophia Institute Press. He appears frequently in print, online, and often is a member of the EWTN Papal Posse. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from the Catholic University of America and has received fellowships to study here in Italy from the Renaissance Society of America and is a Fulbright student in Florence. He's taught in several colleges and universities, and in 2022 was named the inaugural visiting St. John Henry Newman Chair in Catholic Studies at Thomas More College in New Hampshire. He lives in Northern Virginia, well outside the Washington Beltway and its culture, where he tries to cultivate his garden. Please welcome Robert Royal.
Thank you very much, Diane. I'm really honored to be here today, and I was delighted to hear through Diane that the bishop asked me to come and speak, and to be in the presence of men and women that I've admired for decades now, the Cardinal, the Bishop, Jeanne Smits, and Diane herself. Diane gave me 2 directives when she invited me tonight. One is, she said that the bishop wanted a lay man to speak at this event. And some of you probably know that my country, the United States, has been having a problem in defining what is a woman recently. Not less so what is a man. But I was very happy to be invited to do this because I think the perspective of someone like me, who's a layperson living in the world, who has to try to wrestle in a town like Washington, D.C. with many questions, it gives me great hope when I read a book like Credo, because it provides a kind of an understructure for how to respond to these problems. So, in one way, I'm going to be speaking as a lay man. And the other thing that Diane said to me is, you have to bring in something from Dante. It's an inside joke that we have. Dante, the great Catholic poet, maybe the greatest poet of all time, and who I've been obsessed with for decades since I first started studying here in Italy. I even wrote a small book on him for friends of mine who were trying to understand him. But actually, in reflecting on this, I think there is an important point of, what shall we say, connection between Dante's Divine Comedy and this book of Bishop Schneider's called Credo. So I'm going to try to take these 2 points. I'm going to start with a larger, almost kind of cosmological point out of Dante, and then I'll speak as a man from Washington, D.C. Okay. I find myself often quoting these days when I give lectures from the first canto of the Paradiso. And let me just, I'm going to quote this in Italian and then I'll translate it for you. Toward the beginning of Paradiso, this is first canto, Beatrice says to Dante, le cose tutte quante hanno ordine tra loro, e questo è forma che l'universo a Dio fa somigliante. So let me just translate this literally. All things have an order among them, and this is the form that makes the universe resemble God. Now, many of us have probably encountered this idea in studying philosophy and theology, but what it means is this. It means that everything that has been created, in a sense, reflects God, of course. But because of the immensity of God and the richness of God, the only way that the created world can reflect as adequately as it can a God like the Christian God is the entire collection of things that God created and the order that exists among them. Now, this got me thinking, because all of us can look at the individual questions that the bishop treats of so absolutely brilliantly. And Bishop Schneider, I want to also thank you. This is an immense labor of love. And when you read this text, if you go to a specific question, you may want to go to that specific question because you're looking for an answer for that moment. And there are clear, consistent, orderly treatments of all the different issues that the bishop deals with. But I want to make this particular point about Catholicity, because Catholics don't just have a series of questions and answers. We don't have a series of dogmas and doctrines. What we have, and I think that this is something that is unique to this tradition to which we belong, what we have is a vision of the whole. Because I'm sure most of you know that the very word Catholic means according to the whole. And so as you start to look into those specific ideas, and several people have talked about the form of the book and how important that is, I was also very taken with the way that, because of sort of interconnections with the various questions and answers that are given, this begins to suggest to us not only in a series of propositions what Catholicism is, but in that larger order in which everything fits together. And I think that the Catholic tradition, I especially feel this in Washington, D.C., where George Washington once said that politics is not philosophy, and that's an understatement if there ever was one. But it's only in Catholicism these days that we get this balance between the many individual questions that exist and the one. And it's because of the crisis of Catholicity, the crisis that is missing, that enables us to see how all those different pieces are fit together, that especially in a country like mine where we have great technological capacity and various academic disciplines, and we know a lot of specific things, and we even know a few moral principles, but that integrating factor of Catholicity is missing. And so this is one of the reasons why people kind of just say, well, you know, the Catholic view on abortion is sectarian, or about gays, or about trans, because they don't see it all fitted into a rational whole that leads us ultimately to God. And Jeanne Smits was talking about human dignity. Where does human dignity come from, if not from God? It doesn't come from nature. In nature, there's just a sort of power relations, and this is what Marxists typically are expounding, inequality in power relations. It's only because we have that connection with the Creator and the order that the Creator has put into His creation that enables us to talk about even dignity and being made in the image and likeness of God. And it's my contention that it's only the church. It's only the church because of its inheritance from our Jewish forebears, Greek philosophy, Roman law, medieval theology, etc. It's only in the church that you see that kind of organic development of various points. So I want to look at one particular area, which is about the difference between the Creator and the created, which the bishop deals with. And this is a crucial distinction, because a lot of people cannot believe that there is a God who transcends the world. Remember when the New Atheists were riding high in Washington, D.C., one of them was talking with a Dominican theologian friend of mine, and he couldn't understand how there could be a God outside of the universe. That the God, we don't find any evidence of God in the universe, he kept on saying. And my Dominican friend said, of course we don't, because if we did, we'd have a pagan God, or we would be trying to worship something that was actually created and internal to the universe rather than the creator of the universe. So let me just quote this passage. This is in section 86, where the bishop treats of this question. In our time, what is the chief error about the distinction between God and creatures? And here's his answer. The personification and even deification of nature, often manifested in forms of environmental idolatry, ecological mysticism, earth goddess rituals, animism, and other forms of pagan worship. He doesn't mention Pachamama, but he could have. Now, a lot of people will look at this and they'll say, well, look, you know, this is you Catholics, it's just that kind of old-fashioned rejection of other people's religions, etc. But as the bishop makes clear, what's at stake is the very nature of what God is. God is not a thing. He's not part of the creation. He's not like the pagan gods. And more importantly, for us, because of the kind of creatures that we are, rational animals with intellect and will, to submit ourselves to something that is also created, to worship animals, to worship immanent gods, immanent to the creation, is to deny our special status in creation, made in the image and likeness of God. Then there's this. This is in section 95. What is the ultimate end of creation? And here's the answer. To glorify God. Everything comes from God. And here he quotes Romans. For from him and through him and to him are all things. And all works shall give thanks to you, O Lord, and all your faithful shall bless you. This is something quite different from the kind of care for creation that even I think inside the church we're often encouraged to pursue these days. Another point, another question. What then is a divine order that we find inscribed in creation? And I want to say again that it's not only the fact of individual things being created, but the order of all those things. That order that Dante talked about at the beginning of the Paradiso, or Beatrice. The bishop answers, irrational creatures, for example, minerals, plants, animals, are subject to rational creatures, angels and men, which are in turn subject to God, the supreme good and the last end of all things. What is man's duty toward the creatures? Not to seek his ultimate fulfillment in them, to respect and learn from them as works of divine wisdom, to use them responsibly as means to rise to God. This is that constant, you see this everywhere in this book, this constant kind of impulse toward the divine, which is what orders everything. It's the order that comes to us, and it's the order that leads us to rise to God. In all his actions, man, woman, is to seek first the glory of God. Now, I think all that is necessary to say at rather a high intellectual level, but I think we also, all of us in this room, know that a cardinal prominent in the synod, the current synod, asserted even before the synod began that modern science has shown that church teaching on homosexuality is wrong. It's been indicated to be wrong. He even claimed that Pope Francis is of the same opinion as he is. Now, we can't know for sure what that claim is, but I think we can know absolutely with confidence that the assertion about homosexuality is wrong. It's wrong as a moral judgment. It's not only false, but it's absurd. I mean, it's literally absurd precisely in scientific terms. Because real science, contrary to what the Cardinal was saying, real science, and the bishop talks about this in the course of his book, is a value-free, very important, very useful thing for us to pursue. We learn about the creation. There are many things that, because we know the creation better, enable us to speak with more accuracy about God himself. But as a moral judgment, in scientific terms, this is mixing two things that at the very beginning of modern science were separated. Modern science, we are told, is value-free, it's empirical, it just looks at the facts on the ground. It can't tell us one way or another anything about a moral issue like homosexuality. And I think we have to say that, objectively speaking, just to look at our biology, all these kind of sexual minorities that were indulged during the course of the synod are refuted by the large facts of biology. And this was known to just about everyone throughout history. And unfortunately, the Cardinal went even further than that. He talked about the Galileo case, as if the Galileo case can be used to show how we can change the teaching on homosexuality, just as in the same way that Galileo allegedly showed that the Earth circles around the sun. As a matter of scientific and historical fact, there was not dispositive evidence at that point, but he was actually doing something different. He was doing what was called saving the appearances, which means that science doesn't one day overturn the idea that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but it gives us a set of ideas in the background for why those things happen. And an awful lot of claims are being made at the present moment about science and genetics, et cetera, explaining away a hot-button issue like homosexuality. And yet, when we look to the science, there is no gay gene. There is no sociological or psychological mechanism that we know for certain leads in one way or another to these sexual aberrations. And I myself, frankly, would not rule out evil spirits here. I think that the bishop talks about that in the course of the book, and we have to recognize that the darkening of our intellects and the bending of our wills has something to do with a spiritual battle that's going on. Now, is it true, as some have claimed in the recent synod, that we need to adapt in order to be pastoral toward people? Is it true that indulging that false teaching actually helps people? Well, in my country, we are very empirical, and here I'm going to really speak like an American. Friends of mine, psychiatrists, psychologists, professors who have actually looked into the data show that people who have, for example, trans surgeries are not any happier than they were before they had the trans surgeries. That in fact, it is not the case that your children, this is what parents are being told in a place like the United States, your children are going to commit suicide because they're denied transition from whatever sex that they were so-called assigned at birth and that they find is not congruent with their feelings about who they are. And it's not surprising that this is the case, because if we do believe in that order that God created, that is reflected in the bishop's book point by point, it's no surprise that even in this world, human flourishing is not advanced by denying the truth, that deep truth that orients all human beings and that we find in our faith. I have to say that I was appalled that even at the synod, the term LGBT was thrown around so promiscuously, if I can put it that way. As if we Catholics now accept that kind of framing of a whole set of issues, which immediately, I like to say it's like playing football and you give the other team the ball on your 5-yard line, and meanwhile you're trying to organize your defense and you're not ready for it. It gives up half the game. And it hasn't even stopped there. I happened to notice that when Justin Trudeau was being attacked recently in Canada, because he had tried to say that parents who were trying to resist LGBT and the trans social contagion that exists in the West, that they were harming children. He said, this is an interesting thing, he said he was interested in protecting 2 SLGBTQI+ people. See, and you thought LGBT was already radical. So LGBT is already way, way behind the secular curve on this. And it's not surprising, because once you depart from the only order that is, which is the order that God created, of course there is going to be this fracturing and this vociferous nature of what people claim. And there still are plenty of letters of the alphabet and numbers that we haven't used yet, and you're probably going to see these in a short while. I think one of the things that struck me as I was reading through the bishop's book is how far we've fallen away from the idea that I think most human beings once took very seriously, that life on this earth is short and that eternity is pretty long. Right? And that you really, any person who has the kind of order in his soul that reflects that reality is going to think about things very, very differently than the secular world in which we're involved with. I could go on in this line of discourse, but I want to get to this second large point that I want to make about being a man, being a father and a husband and a grandfather and a brother in the modern world, and how the bishop's book helps us because of the lucid way that it presents the faith. To begin with, one of the things that I like to affirm in Washington, D.C. is the Catholic view of life in this world is that it's not the individual person who is the basis of society and the way that we should think. It's the family. It's a fundamental principle in Catholic social thought. And when things are going right, people who are properly formed in families tend to do much better. We have empirical data about this as well. It's not simply that we have a revelation from God and we know that that's true, but we can even see it in the scientific data that people who come from intact families, meaning there is a male and female who are married and married lifelong, children who are produced in those unions are happier, they're healthier, they're less subject to alcoholism, less subject to drug addiction, criminality, violence, etc. So even our secular science reaffirms things that are taught us by revelation. And it's certainly not the case that race, class, and gender can replace the traditional organic societies that the church has always pointed to, which are family, church, and communities. And I'd like to read you here a passage from I think a modern prophet, another one of my favorite writers, because this really resonates with me. And I think if you start to read the bishop's book, you'll see that in many, many questions, this is a phenomenon that he's seeking to respond to. This is a brief passage from Charles Péguy, the great French writer at the beginning of the 20th century. There is only one adventurer in the world, as can be seen clearly in the modern world, the father of a family. Even the most desperate adventurers are nothing compared with him. Everything in the modern world, even and perhaps most of all contempt, is organized against that fool, that imprudent, daring fool, against the unruly, audacious man who is daring enough to have a wife and family. Everything is against him. He alone is an adventurer. The rest are at most engaged with their heads, which is nothing. He is engaged with all his limbs. The rest suffer for themselves in the first degree. He alone suffers through others. Now, I can tell you as a father of 3 and a grandfather of 7 and a half, the half may already be a whole by the time I get home tomorrow. I'm not sure. But there are new things that have come to light, and one of the things I especially liked in the bishop's treatment of families is that they should teach children that neither poverty nor wealth in themselves have a moral dimension. And I think we really need to look at this carefully at this point, because historically we've always worried about the pressure that poverty places on families. And of course, there was problems all around the world of economic poverty are still valid. But because of the way that the modern world has produced a much increased wealth almost everywhere, and how globalization has begun to spread it almost everywhere, we have now a very different, namely that wealth itself has become a threat not only to religion, but to virtuous living. We know that in every society that has become wealthier, almost inevitably, I don't think this has to be, but almost inevitably it begins to show, that society begins to show a decline in religious practice. And I think the bishop quite rightly points to the fact that we have to look at the availability of material goods and learn and teach children and learn ourselves that we have to be able to deal in circumstances of much greater material abundance than ever before. I mean, we're all wealthy by historical standards. We're wealthier than kings and emperors were in the past. That we need something new. St. John Henry Newman said already in the 19th century that the development of wealth, technologies, power in the modern world required us to have an increment of soul. In other words, a growth in maturity and virtuousness to be able to properly handle this wealth that we have. I'm sad to say that I don't think we've seen that, even though many of us, I think many more of us than in the past, know that it's a necessity at this moment. But I want to leave you with that point, that there's now the challenge of material wealth, because we're going to be living in terms of material wealth unless our civilization collapses, which is not an impossibility. And families are very important to developing that mentality. My colleague at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, Mary Eberstadt, has, I think, demonstrated beyond all reasonable doubt that when you lose the family, you lose God. I was frustrated these past weeks that the Synod was not talking very much about families at all. And where does the most immediate evangelization take place? Jeanne Smits talked about the dedication to mothers at the beginning of the book, but where does it generally take place? In the family. Now, there are cases where when religion breaks down, the family breaks down, but Mary, I think, has shown remarkably that where the family breaks down is where we're mostly getting the phenomenon of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who have no religion other than a very vague idea about a higher power. I especially like this passage from the bishop's book. This is section 465. Is unguarded access to digital communication, God help us, digital communication technologies harmful to children? Very direct answer. Yes. Such tools, especially social media and personal devices with internet access, are generally designed to foster vicious curiosity. They impair the development of critical thought, interfere with memory retention, develop addiction to superficial pleasures, encourage materialism and consumerism, and circumvent the loving protection of parental authority. In short, they expose the child to a near and constant occasion of sin. And that's not even to talk about the problem of pornography, which comes along with the internet. Look, by way of conclusion, our democratic governments are wonderful in many ways. But we're living in developed societies that more and more believe that our children, indeed all of us, belong to the state. And I think we need to put that very bluntly. And the bishop in his book talks about the way that families recognize the proper authorities of the state and the political order, but also have to be a bulwark. This is also classical Catholic teaching. That now we even hear about the children being taken away from their families because the families won't affirm, sexual transitioning or where it might be. And meanwhile, adults, it seems very soon are going to be subject to being eliminated through euthanasia, assisted suicide, population control, etc. We're all being threatened with that political totalitarianism that means that we belong to the state. But we don't. We belong to God. And everything in our created world is pointed toward him because he has organized that universal order in which we find ourselves. It's only people who are trained in heart and mind to resist these trends, which I think are leading to demographic and spiritual suicide in the West, in our formerly Christian nations. It's only people who have been trained to resist. And there's very good training in reading this book and pondering it deeply. It's only such people who are going to provide a resistance and a little glimmer of hope. This is a very, very useful tool for working out our temporal and eternal destinies at a very perilous moment. And I fervently hope that many people will not only read and study this book carefully, but take it deeply to heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I don't regret at all making my 2 requests, that you speak as a layman and that you bring in Dante. He's a bit of an expert in Dante. Thank you very much. Also, just to remind everyone, this event is being live streamed. We have a camera in the middle of the room, so please do not pass in front of it, as we have a lot of people from around the world watching via live stream. Also, after the presentation, we'll have a time for question and answer for all of our distinguished speakers. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Schneider. Born Antonio Schneider on April 7, 1961 in Kyrgyzstan, USSR, Bishop Schneider's early years were spent in the Soviet underground church before emigrating with his family to Germany in 1973. In 1982, he entered in Austria the Canons Regular of the Holy Cross, originally founded in Coimbra, and he received the religious name Athanasius. He was ordained to the priesthood in Brazil on March 25, 1990. Having earned a doctorate in petrology at the Agostinianum here in Rome, he taught at the seminary in Karaganda, Kazakhstan. Appointed to the episcopate by Pope Benedict XVI in June 2006, at the age of 45, he was consecrated a bishop in St. Peter's Basilica. From 2011 until the present, he has been auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of St. Mary in Astana, Kazakhstan. He's the author of several books, including Christus Vincit, which we launched here in 2019, and the Catholic Mass. Please offer a warm welcome to His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Schneider.
Your Eminence, dear Cardinal Sarah, dear Reverend Father Priests, dear brothers and sisters. The book, Credo, Compendium of the Catholic Faith, was, to say the truth, not my idea and not my initiative. I was compelled to do it by the requests of brave Catholic lay faithful, fathers of family. This was a kind of synodal method, yet with a helpful and Catholic effect. The idea came from the faithful, addressed to those who are in the church, who in the church have the sacred and grave task of teachers of the faith, that is to say of the bishops, in this case to me. It is my duty to name here these brave Catholics. First, Mr. Aaron Sang, who is here present, who initiated the Tradivox, which is a Catholic educational resource company with the mission of giving voice to tradition by offering an accessible collection of traditional catechisms, which will stand as a remedy for the confusion and error of our time and as an enduring testimony to the divine mission of the Catholic Church. Next, I must thank Mr. Charlie McKenney, the director of the Sophia Institute Press. Charlie McKenney and Aaron Sang are the inspirers and effective drivers of this work. Thanks to their insistence, I agreed to undertake such a demanding and responsible work. This recalls me the words of a church father from the 6th century, St. Caesarius of Arles, who said that when a calf is hungry, it goes to the cow, its mother, to get milk. The cow, however, does not give it right away. It seems that she withholds it. And what does the calf do? It knocks with its nose at the cow's udder so that the milk will come. It is a beautiful image. So also you must be with your pastors, this said, always knock at their door, at their hearts, that they may give you the milk of doctrine, the milk of grace, the milk of guidance. This is a quotation of Pope Francis, of his words at the Regina Coeli prayer on May 11, 2014. I also owe my gratitude to several highly qualified theologians from different countries who made a major contribution to this text by proposing valuable suggestions and amendments from 7 countries, theologians. I would like to emphasize the contribution of those who wrote the endorsements for this book. They are a truly Catholic representation, both geographically and hierarchically. Africa, our dear Cardinal Sarah, North and South America, Asia and Europe, a cardinal, an East and Latin Rite bishop, a priest, contemplative nuns, a husband and a father and a wife and mother. A kind of synodal dimension. I consider it a special sign of divine providence that there was granted the imprimatur from the Bishop of Manchester in New Hampshire, United States, the diocese where Sophia Institute is located. Furthermore, I felt this sign of the providence the more touching by the fact that the bishop who gave the imprimatur without knowing nothing granted the imprimatur exactly on the feast of the main patroness of Kazakhstan, Our Lady of Peace, venerated in the National Marian Shrine in Ozerno in my diocese, where His Eminence was already visited several times. And it was the day where we made the coronation of Our Lady this year. We crowned her, and this day, Bishop of Manchester gave the imprimatur without knowing nothing. The teaching of the Catechism is, in the words of Pope Benedict XIV, the most useful of institutions for the glory of God and the salvation of souls. Pope Pius X wrote as Cardinal Patriarch of Venice a letter where he stressed the vital importance of a clear and precise catechetical instruction, since one of the deepest thirsts of the people is the thirst for truth. In 1894, Cardinal Sarah wrote, I quote, "We preach too much, we teach too little. We must put aside these florid speeches and preach piously and simply to the people the truth of faith, the commandments of the church, the teaching of the gospel, the vices and the virtues, because it often happens that persons well instructed in profane sciences do not know or misknow the truth of faith and know less of the catechism than idiotic children do. Think of the good of souls more than the impression of you hope to make. The people thirst for truth. Let them be given what they need, or the salvation of their souls. And so instructed in their own language, touched and moved, they will weep over their faults and approach the divine sacraments." So, Cardinal Sarah. The Catholic faith is greater. It precedes and transcends the popes and the bishops, because they are the first ones who must obey the faith exemplarily and to transmit it integrally to the faithful. The Catholic faith belongs to all times, to all places, to all generations of Catholic, starting with the apostles and going through all the fathers and doctors of the church and all the saints we know. What should true Catholics do if they are confused or persecuted even within the church? St. Vincent de Lerins, a church father from the 5th century, gave useful guidelines in this regard when he said, I quote, "If some new contagion seeks to infect not only an insignificant part of the church, but the whole church, what shall we do? Then it will be up to you to cling to antiquity, which today cannot be seduced by any fraud or novelty. He must consult and interrogate the opinions of the ancients, of those, that is to say, that although they live in different times and places, but continue in the communion and faith of the only Catholic Church, recognized and approved authorities. And in any case, it must make sure that it has been sustained, written, taught, not only by one or two authorities, but by all equally, with a consent openly, frequently, persistently." End of quotation, St. Vincent of Lerins. In his monumental work about catechetical instruction, De Catechizandis Rudibus, St. Augustine explained the very aim of all knowledge of truth, that is to say, the very aim of catechism and or a compendium of the faith consists in a virtuous life according to the recognized truth and according to the right worship, which on their part have as their very aim the eternal beatitude. I quote St. Augustine. He said, "Believe these things in the catechism. Therefore, and be on your guard against temptations, so that not only may the devil, that adversary, fail to seduce you by the help of those who are without the church, whether they are pagans or Jews or heretics, but you yourself also may decline to follow the example of those within the Catholic Church itself, whom you see leading an evil life, either indulging in excess in the pleasures or unchastity, or by living in the pomp and inflated arrogance and pride, or by pursuing any sort of life which the law condemns and punishes. But rather connect yourself with the good, whom you will easily find out if you yourself were once become of that character, so that you may unite with each other in worshiping and loving God for his own sake, for he himself will be your complete reward to the intent that we may enjoy his goodness and beauty in that life. He is to be loved, however, not in the way in which any object that is seen with the eyes is loved, but with a wisdom is loved, with truth, holiness, righteousness, charity, and whatever else may be mentioned as of kindred nature. So Saint Augustine. Juan Donoso Cortés, a great Spanish Catholic apologist from the 19th century, made the following observation, I quote: "The day when society, forgetting the doctrinal decisions of the Church, has asked the press and the tribune, news writers and assemblies, what is truth and what is error, on that day error and truth are confounded in all intellects. Society enters on the regions of shadows and falls under the empire of fictions." So Donoso Cortés. St. John Henry Newman said, I quote him, "A sound, accurate, complete knowledge of Catholic theology is the best weapon after a good life in controversy. Any child well instructed in the catechism is, without intending it, a real missionary. And why? Because the world is full of doubtings and uncertainty and of inconsistent doctrine. A clear, consistent idea of revealed truth, on the contrary, cannot be found outside of the Catholic truth. Consistency, completeness, is a persuasive argument for a system being true. Certainly, if it be inconsistent, it is not truth." So, St. John Henry Newman. St. Fidelis of Sigmaringen, the first martyr of the Capuchin order, martyred by Protestants, heretics, left us a kind of testament, the following affirmation before his martyrdom, exclaiming, quotation, "O Catholic faith, how solid, how strong you are, how deeply rooted, how firmly founded on a solid rock. Heaven and earth will pass away, but you, Catholic faith, can never pass away." St. Fidelis of Sigmaringen. Let us humbly ask the Lord to grant us, through the intercession of Our Lady, the grace to be able to say, "I know my Catholic faith. I will not permit to be confused. For the sake of this faith, I am ready to die. Thank you.
Now we have time for questions. If I may ask, Charlie, if anyone can ask a question, I would ask that if you are from the media, that you say your name and what outlet or agency you're from. So this can...
I'm Michael Matt from the Remnant Press in the United States. Your Excellency, Your Eminence, thank you so much. I just had a question, sort of a practical question regarding the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which I understand was primarily directed at pastors. And I wonder if you could say something about your decision, as you say, to give this to families, to give this to fathers, this particular catechism that you've talked about. And I think it is so essential as a father to have this catechism. I have 7 children, to be able to educate my children, our children, in a practical and beautiful way. Can you say something about how one would go about then carrying on the tradition of the Catechism of Trent to try to instruct the pastors, our pastors, not only in the catechetical, in the faith, but also that they would see, that we can convince our pastors to see the necessity of adopting a catechism like you've written here and encouraging it throughout Catholic schools, throughout the homeschool movement. In other words, if we had our pastors to encourage us to use your catechism, it seemed like it would be just such a beautiful thing. Can you say something on how we might approach pastors to use your book?
Yes, the Catechism of the so-called Council of Trent was addressed to the parish priests first, and it was a basic catechism, and now in our day, I mean, there passed so many centuries since Council of Trent. We had really new topics, new situations which we have to address, as it was mentioned here by the others. The current doctrinal confusion and the reigning indoctrination of totalitarianism and so on. Therefore, I think the parish priests could use this book because they are really addressed current topics which also people need to have an answer.
Other questions? Surely. From the back? Yes.
Thank you.
Just if you would wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Vincenzo Randazzo with 1 Peter 5. Your Excellency, can you, if we were to, if a family, a father were to have, let's say, I'll say 4 books to teach their children, would this be on that list?
Yes, I do not consider my books such important, but I think the first is, of course, the Holy Scripture, and then a good prayer book, to Catholic prayers, to teach your children to pray in a Catholic way, to know, and then life of the saints. I think it's important, the examples, and then a catechism. You can take also a traditional Baltimore Catechism, for example, and Catechism of Pius X, or for children, special catechisms. So, and when you can choose with some sure catechisms, which they are in the past also.
Yes, Joseph.
Thank you. I'm Joseph Shaw, President of the Univoce International. Thank you very much for your book and your work on this. As we are probably all aware, there's been many catechisms, catechetical programs in English over the recent decades, and they haven't really filled the gap which exists. One reason for that is, no doubt, the content. But I wonder whether you could comment on another reason, which I personally believe, perhaps you disagree with this, but is the connection between the catechism, any catechism, and the spiritual life of the people being catechized, the devotional life, the Christian life in general, including the liturgy, which I think is one of the reasons why the huge efforts which have been made in at least some dioceses and some families, to teach catechism, to produce, more attractive materials, all those sorts of things, has not really worked.
Yes, I would say that Eminence Cardinal Sarah, he published recently a catechism on spiritual life, if I am correct.
Yes.
So there are a catechism for spiritual life from Cardinal Sarah. I would recommend this, for example. There are some passages in this Credo book which are concerning virtues, how to live virtuous life, but it's short questions and answers. Therefore, but to have a more extensive explanation of spiritual life and ascetics, I would recommend the book of Cardinal Sarah. And then the second, which I already mentioned, very important for spiritual life, to read the life of the saints continuously. This is so also important.
Yes, in the back. Just if you could wait for the microphone, please. Your name and the agency you're with. And of course, you may ask questions for any of our speakers this evening.
Sure. My name is John Paul Gutschke, and I'm a videographer for LifeSite News. This is for Your Eminence and Your Excellency. So first of all, thank you very much for this beautiful work, which will serve as a very powerful and insightful guide to all the confusion in the modern world, especially for families where this evangelization has to begin. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on evangelizing people who don't have any faith, the so-called nuns, the people who maybe have a very vague understanding of the Catholic faith or have fallen away? Once the evangelization has taken place in the family and with the help of this work that you've done, what do you think is the most effective way to evangelize people who really aren't religious at all?
Penso che non possiamo chiedere a una sola persona di toccare tutte le problematiche che incontriamo nella vita.
Posso tradurre, Sua Eminenza? He said, I don't think that we can expect of one person to touch upon all of the issues that are part of life.
Guardate, i Vangeli sono stati scritti da Matteo, Marco, Luca e Giovanni. Cioè, ciascuno insiste su una particolarità.
If we look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all had their own particularity and aspect to it.
E dunque siamo un corpo con differenti membra e ciascuno ha il suo scopo, la sua competenza.
And so we're all one body and one mystical body in Christ. And so each member, there are different members, and each member has his own responsibility and task.
Prima hanno chiesto un catechismo della vita spirituale, ho pensato a questo, però la vita spirituale è soprattutto una conoscenza della parola di Dio. l'Antico e il Nuovo Testamento.
He said that when he was considering doing the catechism on the spiritual life, he considered this. And if you look at the Holy Scriptures, both in the Old and New Testament,
È una riflessione teologica sui sacramenti.
it's a theological reflection on the sacraments.
E poi si tocca anche come pregare, che cos'è la preghiera.
And then we have to think about what is prayer and how do we pray.
Che cos'è la liturgia? Perché lì è l'unico modo di incontrare Dio faccia a faccia.
And what is the liturgy? Because really the liturgy is the only way to meet God face to face.
E dunque penso che dobbiamo lavorare insieme per nutrire il popolo di Dio con una sana dottrina.
And so I think that we really need to work together in order that the people of God are nourished with sound doctrine.
Soprattutto insistere su un rapporto personale e intimo con Dio.
Especially focusing upon the personal and intimate relationship with God.
È vero che dobbiamo lavorare per affrontare i problemi attuali,
It's true that we have to work in order to face the problems that the modern society
le
faces,
nuove ideologie,
the new ideologies.
però non possiamo trovare soluzione senza l'aiuto di Dio, senza la sua parola, senza la sua ispirazione.
But we can't find any solution without God, without His inspiration.
Mi sembra che oggi l'urgenza è promuovere un rapporto personale con Dio.
It seems to me today that what is urgent is to promote a personal relationship with God.
Questi troppo incontri, assemblea per discutere sono utili, se è vero.
These assemblies, one after another, they can be helpful in order to discuss things.
Ma io penso che come Cristo ha avvicinato 12 apostoli per 3 anni senza mandarli a fare l'apostolato,
But I think that just as Christ drew to himself 12 disciples who would become the apostles and not just sending them out,
mi sembra che oggi ciascuno di noi deve fare questo nella sua famiglia, come parroco, come vescovo.
it seems that each of us today need to do that as the father of a family, as a bishop, as a parish priest. Where has the microphone gone? We have some questions up in the front. Perhaps, was there one? Yes, Father.
Hello, Father João from Senza Pagare blog. First of all, I would like to thank very much His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Schneider for this wonderful and very important work for the Church nowadays. My question would be to His Eminence, Cardinal Sarah. Your Eminence, in your presentation, you said very well that the Church is not in crisis, but the pastors are. And of course, this crisis of pastors also reflects in the faithful. And I remember some years ago you talked about this silent apostasy that was happening in the Church. My question is, what do you think is the role of Africa in this situation of the Church nowadays?
È difficile rispondere a questa domanda perché l'Africa è una chiesa molto giovane, però l'Africa può portare un aiuto alla chiesa che sta invecchiando in Europa.
It's difficult to answer this question because Africa is a very young church, but nonetheless it can be said that it can bring help to a church or to regions of the world that are growing old.
È vero che gli ultimi papi hanno guardato verso l'Africa con tanta speranza.
It's true that recent popes have looked to Africa with great hope.
Papa Paolo VI ha detto che la nuova patria di Cristo è l'Africa.
Paul VI said that the new patria, the new patria of Christ is Africa.
Papa Benedetto ha detto che il polmone spirituale dell'umanità è l'Africa.
Pope Benedict XVI said the spiritual lungs of the church is Africa.
Papa Giovanni Paolo II ha detto che il nome di ogni sacro africano è scritto nelle palme crocifisso di Gesù Cristo.
Può ripetere quello non ho sentito.
Che il nome di ogni africano è scritto nelle palme crocifisso di Gesù Cristo.
Pope John Paul II said that the name of each African is written on the palm of Jesus Christ.
È vero che abbiamo energie nuove, una fede forte, però abbiamo bisogno di voi che avete una lunga esperienza teologica, monastica, liturgica.
It's true that there's a lot of energy and youth in Africa, but we also need the tradition that comes from the West in terms of liturgy and monasticism and theology.
Penso che dobbiamo stare insieme per affrontare la situazione odierna, per essere più cattolici, più cristiani.
We really need to stay together and to work together in order to face the crises and challenges that face us today.
Dio usa ciò che è niente per mostrare la sua potenza. L'Africa è niente, però può essere usata da Dio per dare alla Chiesa una nuova energia spirituale.
God chooses the weak and uses what is nothing in order to confound the wise and do great things. And so Africa is nothing, but God can use it in order to bring new energy to the church.
La domanda è troppo difficile, però l'Africa non può portare niente, può partecipare alla nuova vitalità della Chiesa oggi.
It might be difficult to say, but Africa is nothing of itself, but with God it can participate in the life of the church and bring new energy.
Ma l'Africa ha bisogno di voi che avete una lunga esperienza con Cristo.
But Africa needs you who have a long experience and tradition with Christ. Yes, we have a question. Yes, Phil Puella.
Your Excellency, Phil Pulela, I'm a correspondent for Reuters. First of all, I would like to thank you for your availability to take questions. I would venture to say that not every prelate who is conservative is courageous enough to take questions from people who don't necessarily agree with them, so thank you for that. What I would like to ask you was something that we had a conversation, which you probably don't remember, when the Pope was in Kazakhstan. How do you see your role in your relationship with Francis? You said, I think you were saying that, if I remember correctly, that is the role of a friend to point out errors, if I'm not mistaken. How do you see your role? I would venture to say that most of the people in this room are very critical of the current pontiff. So how do you see your role in talking to the Pope? Will you be seeing him while you're here? Secondly, could you tell us your opinion of the latest dubia? I don't think you've spoken out about that, but you may have, but can you tell me? Thank you.
First, my relationship with the Pope, of course, he is the Peter of our time. I am, as a bishop, the member of the Collegium of the Bishops, and so and the relationship with the Pope is brothers, fraternity first. The Pope is not a boss, in a worldly manner, and the bishops are not employees. This would be very worldly, and this is not correct. Our Lord Jesus Christ said to Peter, exactly Peter, and to the apostles, do not dominate your brothers. And so, therefore, the bishops must have the freedom also to speak to the Pope. Otherwise, there is no true fraternal relationship. When I am not able, or when I am fearing that when I will speak, even an admonition with reverence, of course, to the Pope to help him, then we have no fraternal relationship. There is no true collegiality. There is fear, and this should not be in the Church. And even Pope Francis, he sometimes called the bishops to have the paresia. It means this is a free speech, and he likes this. And this I try to do, but always in the respectful form. This is important. So, and when I am in my conscience as a bishop seeing some dangers for the entire body of the Church, we are a family. The Church is not an NGO, or we are a family. In a family, you can say to the father or to the elder brother, respectfully, also some admonitions. And this climate should be in the Church, but this is missing. I'm seeing bishops are intimidated. Many. They don't have the courage to say something. For the love for the Pope, even. And this, when I am really saying this in all my conscience, it is for love for him, for real brotherly love. And I will tell him, Holy Father, I am your best friend. I have never prayed so much for no one in my life as for Pope Francis, really. And when I made some statements, even publicly, I did this for love for him, to help him, as St. Paul did to Peter in Antioch, or as some saints did in the past, St. Bridget, St. Catherine of Siena. They addressed the Pope with very clear statements. And so I think this should be our climate in the Church, spiritual. Then the second question, what is it?
It was regarding your thoughts. You really haven't
yes,
spoken
the
about
dubia.
the
Yes,
dubia.
I consider the dubia presented by the 5 cardinals, inclusively the present cardinal here, Robert Sarah, is a great work. It will go down in history as a heroic act, I think. It will go down in history. We should live not for this time. We should live for next 100 to 200 years and for eternity. This matters. Not what today is said about this, but it is objectively, I think it was a must-needed action of the cardinals to present the Pope the dubia in clarity. And I think it is a meritorious, heroic act.
Let's see. We just have time, perhaps one more question? Yes. If you could just wait for the microphone, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Claire Jeanne Gravet, Religion News Service. Since we're on topic, I would like to know what both of you think about the answers that Pope Francis provided regarding the dubia.
The answers the Pope provided are unfortunately unsatisfactory. They cause more dubia than resolved. We have to be honest. We cannot make here some fictions and to lie one to another. It would be not honest. We are not little children. We have to be honest. The answers was confusing, vague, and an art of confusion, really, the answers. This must be stated. Unfortunately, we have to state this and then to pray for the Pope to help him, maybe to give then more clear answers to help him.
Very good. We'll have to end there now. Many thanks to, Your Eminence, did you want to add anything? No, okay. Many thanks to our distinguished panel, His Eminence Robert Cardinal Sarah, His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Schneider, Jeanne Smits, and Robert Royal. Thank you especially to Charlie McKinney and to Sophia Institute Press for making this evening possible. Thanks also for our guests who are present here in Rome and for all those who are watching around the world via live stream. May I ask perhaps Your Eminence, may we have your blessing before we conclude? Just one note, if you could all sit down so I can announce to those watching live stream. To order Credo, and which can be ordered with an accompanying study journal, visit Sophia Press's website at sophiainstitute.com. That's Sophia Institute. Where is Charlie McKinney? sophiainstitute.com. That's sophiainstitute.com. From all of us here in Rome to those watching from live stream, we hope you enjoy this evening and we wish you a blessed rest of your evening. Thank you. If I may also add, there's some refreshments and aperitivo outside in the cloister.